So, hello. Welcome to this session on trade wars, conflicts, and global governance. My name is Terry Martin. I'm a news anchor with Germany's foreign broadcasting service, Deutsche Welle. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this session today. I want to thank the Aspen Institute and the German Marshall Fund of Bucharest for having me. So, we're talking about trade policy, right? Trade policy is also foreign policy, of course. It is used as a foreign policy tool. Sometimes it's used as a foreign policy weapon. Just ask anyone who lives in Russia or Iran when it comes to sanctions or tariffs and how these affect countries and people and businesses who live there. So trade policy is foreign policy, so we're going to be talking about that over the next hour or so. I've been told to keep this a little shorter. I was taken to lunch, almost against my will, but it was also a fruitful experience, I assure you. Anyway, right now we are witnessing a conflict of monumental proportions, and we know exactly what we're talking about. It was a topic at lunch again, too. It's a topic at these forums all over the world right now, and that is the confrontation between the United States and China. Now, to some degree, that conflict is a systemic geopolitical confrontation, but its most prominent manifestation right now is the trade war. I will call it a trade war. Some might prefer to call it something else, but it is essentially a trade war. Now, that trade war is affecting the world economy already. Countries around the world, governments around the world, are already, and institutions who track the global economy are already adjusting their forecasts, and it's being felt in different ways. Peanut butter, I love peanut butter. We're seeing just even in the conflict between the United States and Europe, peanut butter is on that list, right, of sanctioned items. So peanut butter is becoming more difficult for me to get, and that is a serious thing indeed. So we're talking about the trade war affecting the world economy. It's disrupting supply chains in ways I hope we're going to hear more about over the next hour. And when you disrupt supply chains, a lot of things happen. It has a knock-on effect. It doesn't just affect the businesses involved, of course. It affects everything that is dependent on those businesses, like people who work, for example. And it creates an atmosphere of deep uncertainty and anxiety, which is what we're experiencing right now. This whole forum kicked off with the notion that we are still in even deeper than a year ago into a pattern of disruption and uncertainty, and we don't really know where this is going. So I'm hoping we'll get a little bit of clarity today, not just on the conflict between China and the United States, but also on other conflicts, other trade conflicts. We have representatives from the UK, from China, and Japan with us. I'm going to introduce them right now, and we'll get things kicked off. Just one little warning, something to have in the back of your mind. We will be inviting questions from you towards the end, the last 20 minutes or so. We want to open it up for questions, so you can begin to already ruminate and think about what questions you might want to put to the panelists. So let's get underway. It's my great pleasure to introduce the three panelists. I'll just invite you to come up here in whatever order you wish, starting with Shinichi Nakabayashi. He is director for Japan at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We also have with us Kerry Brown, director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. And our third panelist, coming all the way from China, is Canrong, Associate Dean of the School of International Studies at Renmin University in China. First of all, a warm round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for being with us. Now, we've had a bit of correspondence before we showed up here in Bucharest, and I gave the panelists a few questions to reflect on. And I'd like to begin by putting the first big picture question to our panelists, and you guys can take about 5 to 7 minutes each maybe to answer these. And the big picture question is, What do current trade wars and conflicts tell us about the global economic and political order and about global governance? So that's basically the title of our talk, so you can go wherever you want with that. Why don't we start right here to my right then, if you don't mind, Dr. Jin. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. Thanks for the host of this event. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is my first time to be here. I used to be trained as a student of American politics. So next year, I will get a lot of interview to predict who will be the next president of the United States. For me, I think the most important challenge for today's world is that we are facing the deficit of global governance. China benefited from globalization a lot in the past 4 decades. Many people believe China is one of the countries benefit most. We appreciate this process. But very unfortunately now, this process reversed to some extent. The fact is that there are more global challenges occurred now, including climate change. So the demand for global governance keep rising. But on the other side, the supply of global governance, to some extent, it decreased. The one reason is that the US don't want to offer that supply. US still owns enough resources, but become very selfish, right? The US administration now dominant by, nationalism, American first, buy America, hire America, just like, the third world political leader, right? So US still owns resources, but they don't want to spend money. So US becomes selfish. And the EU still build very strong will to offer this global governance, but the EU has its problem, right? You become weak after the Brexit. So that's the problem. Used to be, we have to say, the world benefit from the supply of global governance mainly from US and EU. But now we see the supply side, they don't want to supply. China wants to join.
When you're talking about the supply, you're talking about global governance?
Global governance.
They're not supplying, okay. Just want to be clear about that.
You see the problem of logic, demand keep rising and the supply very hesitate, right? China want to join in, so we offer the One Belt, One Road initiative. But you guys very hesitate to support China.
When you say you guys, you mean?
EU and US.
Okay.
Right? And some people even demoralize Belt and Road initiative. That's ridiculous. That's irresponsible for the global governance. Right? So that's one concern of mine, the deficit of global governance. Second concern definitely relating with US-China relations. I have to say, now and in the future, the US-China relations is most important bilateral type for China, right? We do appreciate the benefit resulted from US-China relations in the past 4 decades after the normalization. We benefit a lot. We appreciate that. But unfortunately, US-China relations will enter a quite long bumpy period, at least last for 1 decade. We have to face in this new reality. Because US now define China as a sort of revisionist country, and they consider terrorism not that important threat, but competition among big powers are now ranking #1, and now they have 2 adversaries: Russia under the Putin the Great, and China and our current leader, right? But from long-term viewpoint, they believe their only adversary should be China, because Russia fell into so-called resources curve, resources trap already, right? So from long-term viewpoint, Russia will be not that strong economically. So they put China on the very top position of adversary. That's not good, no good for U.S.-China relations, right? And as we know, U.S. people easy to, they're not very good at thinking, you know. As for thinking, no good as a European counterpart, but they are very good at action, right? So after they defined China as a revisionist country, they immediately launched the trade war. Actually, our official media not use term trade war. We use term 贸易摩擦 trade friction. We are very cautious. We don't want to exaggerate the seriousness of the situation. So we see now the U.S.-China relations deteriorated since spring last year, right? But as for the trade friction or trade war, I don't worry that much. I tend to believe next month, when we have APEC summit in Chile, right? We will have a partial deal. Because what? Because one side, China compromised a lot. China really don't want to have a trade war. So China did its best to avoid that. As I know, we compromised 80%. Okay. But the problem is on U.S. side, they want to have a 100% deal, right? That's ridiculous. They can never get that. Their choice is 0 and 80, okay. Right? And I think at Chile, President Trump will accept an 80% deal. Okay. Because he need diplomatic victory. Actually, after 3 years ruling, he got nothing in foreign policy. You know, North Korea, he failed. Iran failed. Venezuela failed. Syria failed. Ukraine failed. 0, you know. So he needs something to show to his audience he gets something, you know. So that's why I said, as for trade war, don't worry, we will have a partial deal.
Okay, but thank you so much, Dr. Jin. I'm afraid I'm going to have to, we're going to come back to you, don't worry.
Okay.
It's not, you know, this is going to be a discussion, so it's going to go around and everybody will get time to say. So just a quick summary of what you had to say there. China is looking to Europe and the rest of the world for more global governance, also from the US, but Europe is weak, the US is selfish, and China does see the prospect of a deal shaping up if the US will just back away from its 100% demands, maybe. Okay, very good. Well, Kerry, do you want to pick it up from there?
Well, thanks for inviting me here. It's good to see Dr. Jin again. How's there? You see? Yeah. Let's all just go now and have tea. Thank you for inviting me. So I suppose my question, to everyone really, which I'm thinking about, is it really about trade? It seems to me there's a lot of deep structural issues that are coming sort of to the surface, and trade is like a sort of proxy. One of them is, what is China's rightful place? You mentioned the Belt and Road. And, the Belt and Road is the first proactive time for China to really try and spell out what its international role is. And it looks like it's different things in different places. So the Belt and Road in Central Asia is a different thing to the Belt and Road in India, which is obviously, opposing it in many ways. The Belt and Road in Europe is different to the Belt and Road in America, which doesn't seem to be a part of it. And I guess the Belt and Road to me is kind of interesting because it's really, what does the world look like without America? I mean, what is not in the Belt and Road? The United States. I mean, and Japan, but mostly the United States.
We invited them in. But
I know. So, this vision is clearly quite a geopolitical one. I mean, it's a very big geopolitical one. You can't get rid of the politics. So I suppose, the trade war addresses a huge problem, which is, what does China do when it's number one? Most projections show in the next 5 to 10 years, probably sooner, China will be the world's biggest economy in gross terms. And I know per capita terms, obviously, it's not going to be, it's still way below the levels of the United States. But that is a very different world to the one we are in now. The first issue is, how does the United States respond to that? And that's not an easy question, because the United States is a proud country that, likes to be loved. And we do love America. We do love America. Our love is limitless. But,
We believe you.
there's a bit more competition, So, that's one issue. The second issue is, of course, it's not easy to see how China's economic status translates into political status. And in fact, the problem that we've been talking about in the last day really is the V word, values. And, I guess the sort of problem is the American accusation against China is that it has engaged with the international system, but not really believe in its underlying values. Not really. I'm not saying if that's right or wrong, but that's the American perception. And for all the rest of us, you're dealing with the world's biggest economy at the moment, feeling like it has not been dealt with fairly. The world's second biggest economy, feeling like it has not been dealt with fairly. And there is no easy way to deal with that conflict. I mean, the trade conflict, I guess they can do a deal, but that conflict is a much more subtle one. So I think your forecast about a bumpy period is right, and I don't think it'll be 10 years. I think we are moving into a world in which it's going to be a perpetual part of the global architecture. And once the trade issue, if it's dealt with, is dealt with, there will be other issues. There will be a lot of other issues. So, the question sort of underneath that, just in conclusion, is, what is China's rightful place? And that is partly what does China think its rightful place is, but also partly what is the rest of the world going to, not allow, but be comfortable with. Because if there is resentment on either side about that rightful place, then it's not going to work. So the geopolitics of consent is going to be absolutely crucial. And I guess that's the huge debate that we're going through, which this excellent conference is also contributing to.
Thank you, Kerry. So just again, in summary, we're talking about, in terms of the Sino-American trade dispute, the trade part of that is really just a reflection of a larger geostrategic competition that is underway. Not clear how that's going to go out. And it reflects a deeper clash of values, which, of course, raises the question, how do you overcome those differences and resolve that one? That's a tough one.
So, and also the very final thing is that no one can say to a fifth of humanity that they have to go away. So the fact of China, the fact of its structure, of its population, the huge importance of its emerging middle class, these don't go away. Even if you have, trade friction or trade wars, that doesn't go away. And no amount of confrontation will make that go away.
Okay, Shinichi.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting. Japan had experience of the fierce trade frictions, with the United States, starting in the early 1970s. Started from the textile, then the steel, then the motor cars, and the semiconductors. So it was very, very prolonged, like 3 decades. And at that time, in the middle of the 1980s, the trade, U.S.-Japan relations were very frustrated and very high tensions, and so the United States has changed exchange rate adjustment, like Japanese yen massively appreciated against U.S. dollars, and in order to mitigate the negative impact on the Japanese economy, Japan eased monetary policy and fiscal expansion, and that led to asset price bubble, and the burst of bubbles caused prolonged stagnation of Japan. So Japan went under, but still the trade tensions continued because the trade deficit of the United States continued. And the fundamental reason of the trade deficit of the United States is, too much spending in the United States, like fiscal expansion, the tax cuts, and also the high interest rate to stem the inflation. So the high interest rate, strong dollar, and that caused and so the investment is too much compared with the saving. So, but Japan tried to say that was burdened with making adjustment on behalf of the United States to solve the U.S. macroeconomic problem. Say Japan expanded fiscal policy and monetary policy. That was wrong from the macroeconomic policy coordination perspective. Say that now China learned the lessons, the Japanese lessons, so China was very reluctant to let the exchange rate, the renminbi, appreciate between when the trade surplus ballooned and the trade deficit of the United States ballooned, say after the accession of the WTO in the early 2000. And that caused some problem. Say from the economic perspective, that has many good reasons, and also it comes from the global supply chains. Say Apple and Google has make a lot of profits, and say Japan, Germany, or Korea exports machinery or the important parts to assemble. So China was a training hub, but it was part of the global supply chain. And the bigger profit, say US companies enjoy, or Japanese or Germany, so all benefit. So the breakdown of the global supply chain harms everyone economically. But so this change has come from the deep-seated the change of the perception of the China's peaceful rise in the United States. China tried to raise its economic standards by expanding enjoying the liberal open trade system. So very careful not to threaten other countries from the international security point of view. But because China became more strong, and it will certainly surpass the economic size in the near future. So China's leadership became more bolder and very assertive, about its sovereignty, territorial issue, and also on the information front, the artificial intelligence or cyber security law says China has a very the West thinks that China has control of the data, and also when the President Xi Jinping abolished the two-term limit, that changed. The China will not converge to the plural democracy, or so that will be the divisionist view of the United States. So the Japan was the closest ally of the United States. It will never be. It should have. There has never been a possibility to overtake the United States or threaten the United States militarily. But in the current the changing the technology, China will also threaten the hegemony. So that's the main reason for the confrontation. And for currency, the renminbi actually depreciated, and after the capital flow was relaxed. So that's very different, from the Japanese case. Maybe the development stage is different. China is an emerging market, and the demographic is a little bit worrying for China. In 2015, already the working age population has hit the peak, and the population is aging. So that might be a break on the Chinese rise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So you have used that word hegemony, the idea of vying for hegemony, for dominance in the world economy or world affairs. This brings us to the very difficult question of a contest between major powers. Now, we don't have a representative. This was pretty obvious that we were going to end up talking about the Sino-American trade dispute, right, or the dispute in general. So we just want to make everyone aware. I know that there are other trade disputes, other trade conflicts, trade wars going on in this world, including one between Japan and South Korea, which is a really interesting one to watch. But I guess we will focus on the China-American dispute for the rest of this, just so we're all prepared. If someone wants to go off into another direction, I'm welcome for that in the audience questions. Just wanted a little warning there. So we've talked a little bit about, one more thing. You mentioned the parallels or lack thereof in the trade dispute between Japan and the United States in the 1970s and 80s versus what's going on today. It only applies to some degree. We're talking about different global geostrategic tectonics at work here. What I'd like to do before we move into the ideas of how this is going to play out, that's because I think that's on everyone's mind. How is this going to play out? I just want a quick statement from each of you on what do you see being the primary drivers of this conflict. Starting with you, Dr. Chu.
My opinion is that,
What's making this conflict happen?
My opinion is that the U.S. elites, they made a big mistake in the past, since the end of Cold War. They understood the reason and the result of the end of Cold War. The result of the end of Cold War is that the U.S. got a victory. But the reason why the Cold War ended, because the elites in Soviet Union, they gave up. So that's a very important mistake. Because of that mistake, they confuse two things together. Their conclusion is that because I win I'm the victor of Cold War, so I'm win the Cold War. So they treat Russia as a defeated country, and become very arrogant abroad and within the United States. You know, within the United States, the elites, especially elites in Wall Street, they collect all the money into their pocket, right? No trickle down to the people. So then the Gini index in US is in very serious situation. So that's why the people especially those people in the inland land, they feel they are losers. Now they shifted to populism.
Okay, so
now
what about China? Just
leader.
if I can so that's, again, we want to make these statements brief. So just the second part of that, you've mentioned problem with the U.S. There are two partners in this conflict. Do you see any problem maybe on the side of China in being some responsibility, or
I don't
you can
think
attribute
China should bear any problem. If you blame us just because we did too good a job,
Okay.
we are rising.
All right.
And the U.S. not accepted this react. According to the historian Schlesinger Jr., he said, any country want to have an equal treatment of the United States is not only a mistake, it's a crime.
Okay, let's stop right there.
That's ridiculous.
So, hubris, that marvelous Shakespearean word, which is just essentially arrogance, which is the term you used, is responsible for this current trade war. Maybe you want to have a different view on that, Kerry?
You sound like the English football team. We always get beaten because we're too good. No. It's a terrible parallel. The Soviet Union model is, and the influence of the Soviet Union is an important thing, because I was standing in Revolution Square this morning, and the old building in Revolution Square where Ceausescu made his famous last speech, where he was booed, and looking at the old, the kind of building, the central committee, the Politburo of the Romanian Communist Party, and I was completely on my own, just looking at this building. And then I suddenly heard a load of Chinese, and it's a Chinese delegation coming and looking at this building, the only other tourists there. So I think that shows that there's still a big interest in what happened to the Soviet Union, and not the Soviet Union, but also countries in the communist world then. But to your question, just really quickly, so engagement was in the 1980s. I think for the US and Europe, engagement with China was a gamble. But I think the conviction was that it would lead to, through economic means, to political change, which we heard talked about yesterday.
Exactly.
And that was reasonable and rational. And indeed, until the 1990s, I suppose you could say it looked like the drift of history. I think it was Clinton or Bush said that. The drift of history was going to go that way. However, it is right that the sort of conditions in China and the very particular model there was always going to be different. And it is different. And I mean, really, since China joined the WTO in 2001, its economy has quadrupled. And it's sort of not, it's followed the economic narrative, but not the political narrative. So I think this is what we're seeing now, really, is the end of that phase of engagement.
Well, it sounds like, Kerry, that you're saying essentially what Dr. Jin said there about that, you know, China's just doing really well, and maybe the U.S. underestimated that. And it's what we heard yesterday from the State Department official, Mr. Boise, was that there was a policy of Wandel durch Handel, this sort of transformation through trade, that this would have an effect on China while allowing its economy to grow, that maybe there would be a transformation with respect to the way the country is run. Maybe there wouldn't be a one-party communist rule centrally, you know, or state-controlled capitalism, that it might kind of move in a different direction. That didn't work. So, I mean, it seems like there's a big underestimation. Somebody underestimated what was going to, misestimated, as Bush would say, what happened. Anyway, did you want to comment on this too, Shinichi, before we move on to where this is headed?
Maybe from the economic point of view, the backlash against globalization is working, like, say, the Trump administration or Brexit also. Like, say, the free trade is a good thing economically, so everyone benefits, but those who negatively affected, like dignity of work of the Midwest, the middle class, who work for the General Motors, say, lost a job because of the rise of China, or say, the emerging market more generally. So that's why the political background and probably the lack of communication or the misunderstanding of the intention of the U.S. suspects China, China suspects the United States. So probably China is running the international standards, the existing international standards, like when they established AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, they are headhunting the staff of EBRD or World Bank, and so they try to make its lending standards as a par with the international standards. But some say at issue is like subsidies or state-owned enterprises. That's or intellectual property, the protection of the data. That's a very sensitive issue, and in that sense, we need to say that China, Japan, or China, US, or the Western countries get together and discuss, find a solution, like WTO, or that kind of the discussion.
Well, we're going to get into that in just a moment. So maybe we can just close out this capital of what's driving all of this. It should be, there is no American representative here on the panel. If there were, the Americans would say China is responsible of gross intellectual property theft. It artificially subsidizes its companies, giving them and dumps on world markets, giving an unfair advantage to them and crushing competition coming from other countries. It accuses them. There are lots of there's a laundry list here of issues that the U.S. has. Manipulation of currency, this has also come onto the official agenda. So there are many, many issues here at stake where America, again, quote, wants to create a level playing field, restore a level playing field. There isn't, again, no representative of the Americans on this panel, so I just wanted to lay those out. So let's move on to where this is headed. How do we see this unfolding? And I'd really be interested in getting your views on that. This has been discussed for quite some time, and there are some really dire predictions about where this could possibly go. Already for more than a year, many have been talking about the Thucydides. You have to help me with this. Thucydides, thank you. Thucydides trap. This is the perception that an established power, in this case the US, feels so threatened, so afraid of being eclipsed by a rising power, in this case China, that a war becomes inevitable. Now, do you see things possibly heading in that direction? Is that where this could go? Do you see potential for that? Or do you see some way of resolving this to the mutual benefit of both countries, and not just those two countries, because the entire global economy is dependent upon this getting worked out. How do you see this happening, and what, is there a role for, quote, global governance, and if so, where would that come from? So, who wants to start with that?
Thucydides trap, this term become popular because Alison Graham from JFK Kennedy School published a book called Bound to be a War.
Yeah, Joseph Nye is using it again this week.
Yeah, become popular. But I know Alison very well. His intention is to avoid this trap. He used this term to remind both sides, the leaders, both sides, to be more responsible in order to avoid this war. Because if China and US really involved in the war, then that means the end of the world. Because China also owns the assured mutual destruction capability. Right? China don't want to mention that. Unlike Putin the Great, right? Always reminding people every day. But China really owns that capability, The US can destroy 10 times. I'm very sure we can retaliate at least 3 times.
Okay, we don't want that.
Right. My opinion is very simple. I think the main problem in US-China relations is that there is a logic in the elites of the United States. They made the US yield, but they blame China. That's ridiculous. No matter how they demoralize China, China cannot help them treat themselves. They have to treat it themselves. So until they aware of this fact, they have to address in their own problem, the income gap, the hijack of their politics by big capitals.
And this is going to fix the dispute with China.
Yes, that's a real challenge of the United States.
I don't quite see how that works, but
China will help them. China will not challenge the hegemony of the United States. China is not really interested in Africa, Middle East, Latin America. China.
You're not interested in those areas?
Yeah, we're not interested in that. What we're interested in is what Kerry said.
But you're very involved in these areas.
We want to catch up U.S. in GDP first. I think that will be achieved in the coming decade. Then another challenge is that our per capita catch up in the United States. And let our people living as the people, the same living standard, right?
That makes perfect sense. You want to have the same living standards. That's an aspiration that's shared, I think, by people around the world. The question that is, getting back to it, is how do we see this playing out? Kerry, quickly.
So the kind of so you clearly got 2 players that have profoundly different worldviews,
right?
And the kind of strange thing about Chinese power, I think someone wrote about this, François Julien, a French philosopher, said, Chinese power haunts, it doesn't act. And when you think of what is imputed to China...
It haunts?
Haunts but doesn't act.
Oh, okay. As opposed to thinking, as acting but not thinking, which is suggested about the US.
Yes, as I'm exemplifying now. So you kind of have a power which has this huge military but hasn't had combat experience in '79, really, with Vietnam. You've got a power that I don't think is in the game of trying to change our views about our own system. It's not like the Soviet Union. It hasn't got a sort of proselytizing attitude. It's happy with a Chinese world with its exceptional and unique values and a world which is non-Chinese. And it's interested in particular issues that bring it benefit from that wider world, but it is not interested in that wider world becoming espousers of Chinese values because they're not Chinese. So it's exceptionally exceptionalist.
That's really important to understand, I think. Yeah.
So that seems to me that the only future is one where you have a kind of bipolar order. I mean, not multipolar, because this is profoundly different kind of value system where you have hybridity versus the sort of what Francois Julien also talked about, the proclivity from the West to think of universal values and truth with a capital T. So that means, in essence, we're moving from a bungalow to a two-story building. And as we know, most accidents happen on the stairs. So we have to kind of, I'm not going to start, doing timeshare now, but, we have to be careful about the stairs. But also, we have to remember that the only choice I can see apart from that is we live in a ruin. Okay, because you can't really, sort of have space so sort of neatly delineated. So I think a bipolar, world is absolutely viable. The only other thing is that capitalism has profound structural problems. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Bell, not Daniel Bell in Beijing, but Daniel Bell, the sociologist from the 70s, called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. Capitalism has two major flaws. One is the institutionalization of envy, and two is the worship of the future. The future is all the better, and always better. And I think the Chinese sort of socialism with Chinese characteristics has those structural flaws, and those are ones that you are, in your society, going to be hit with, and are being hit with now, as our societies have been. And no one has found an answer to those issues. So those structural flaws don't go away.
Shinichi, you see us heading towards a happy equilibrium in this two-story house with hopefully no catastrophes on the stairs?
Right. No one knows, but there are uncertainty. But I think the positive direction is like we find dialogue, what strengthens the WTO, the global organization, or the mega regional free trade agreement, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, was started by the Obama administration. That was the flagship policy of the pivot to Asia, and the Trump administration walked away because of America First policy. But Japan resurrected the TPP 11 to wait for the United States to come back. And currently, and also Japan concluded the EU partnership. The Japan-EU economic partnership agreement says probably the counterbalance against the one country, the America First policy or something. So that kind of the partnership will be, and the other largest trading partner, the trading market, the EU has very strong economic clout to shape the future of the world trade regime. And I think that kind of in Asia also, regional comprehensive economic partnership from the comprising of the ASEAN 10 countries, Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and India, Australia, New Zealand. And says India will be, is rising, so that 16 country mega trade also has a potential.
Thank you. So an appeal for multilateralism. There's some multilateral institutions out there, including the EU and ASEAN, perhaps other organizations that may have a mediation role to play in helping to resolve this profound dispute. Let's take some questions, starting with Bobo, who's been chomping at the bit. Go for it.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on Professor Jin Canrong's idea of deficit of global governance, and not least because we've got a plenary session following where we'll discuss some of these issues. What role do you see in filling the deficit of countries such as Russia, India, the European Union? Now, Shinichi mentioned it. Now, Professor Jin, you mentioned Putin the Great in a sort of somewhat ironic tone of voice, which makes me rather suspect that you don't really see that much role for Russia in filling this deficit of global governance.
But he didn't identify himself. He is a Russia specialist, among other things. But go ahead.
But so I'm actually wondering how you see the role of powers like India, Russia, the European Union, whether they can actually achieve some of the ambitions that Professor Nakabayashi has indicated.
I think looking into the future, in the near future, I think we need better cooperation among China, US, EU, and Japan, because we benefit from current arrangement a lot. Basically, Russia is troublemaker. we cannot expect them too much. And India is a very short-run country, you know. India is a short-run country. So anytime you want to involve India in, then you have to face in the slowing down of multilateral cooperation, you know. They're very good at make trouble in, you know, very good. so don't expect that two players too much. I think if we four can make some, you know, cooperation, then that's the way to resolve this issue. Because the reason is very simple: we benefit a lot.
Okay.
Russia not benefit enough from this arrangement.
Very good. Sir?
I'm from the Academy of Contemporary China and International Studies. I have a question for Kerry. We have been talking about deficit. To my mind, it's not only a deficit between China and the United States, but also between China and other countries.
Deficit
between
of
the
trust, governance, or
deficit of
trade?
almost of everything.
Okay,
actually,
everything,
you know.
right.
Deficit of trust between the United States and EU, between EU and China, between Japan and the United States. Okay. Another observation is that what is the root cause of China's latest development over the past 40 years? What is the root cause? Who wins and who loses? I think China's developments, to a large extent, has benefited everything, every country in this world. So my question for Kerry is that with this deficit of mutual trust, especially between the United States and China, what kind of role the EU can play? Thank you.
Well, as you've probably seen today, I think we've just left it. So on behalf of the EU,
It seems we do have a draft agreement.
Yes.
Another.
So I might be staying here for a while. I think the China sees the EU as a cultural superpower, and maybe not a hard power. You know, the EU does not act like the United States, and it's more complex. But I think when Xi Jinping came to Brussels in 2014, he used this, kind of phrase of civilizational partners, which I think is sort of saying the Chinese recognize the cultural power of EU. The problem really, though, that the EU has with America and with many others, not Japan probably, is knowledge levels of China here are poor. So all the issues that Professor Jin and everyone talks about, we don't really know what we're worried about, but we're worried about something. And so, what is this, if we think there's a threat, what is the threat? Because as I just sort of, I don't think China, and you know better than me, wants to change our minds about ourselves. But it probably has things it wants to get its message across about, but then everyone wants to do that. So I think we need to work out our fears more, clearly before we, then sort of get very, very panicky. And that isn't easy until our knowledge level increases. Just finally, Timothy Brook from, Canada, excellent sinologist, has written a book called China Great State about the history of statedom in China over the last 800 years. And he makes a really great point that in the 18th century, when missionaries like the Jesuits went to China and others, the problem was they got to know a lot about China, and China knew very little under the kind of Qing dynasty, knew very little about the outside world. And that's now the other way around. 200 million Chinese people speak English, yet the number speaking Chinese in Europe, though it's increasing, is low. So with that knowledge base, it's really hard to deal with a new partner that has different sorts of values and identity and make the right choices. So that's really, really that's a big quandary.
So, question here in the front, and then to you, and then back there. Okay. If you could keep it brief, that would be great.
Yes, it will. I will be very brief. My name is Lulishki. I'm a former ambassador of Morocco to the UN, and I'm with the Policy Center of the University. I have two short comments. First, about the trade war. And I think that trade war already have produced this consensus about the reform of the WTO. So it has already an impact. I agree with those who say that it's beyond trade war. I think it's about leadership and about international recognition. Leadership for the United States, and whomever comes closer is seen as contender, and she has to be pushed away. In terms of recognition, China is in need to be recognized internationally. If we go back into history, the major decision that reflects this international recognition was in the 70s, when Beijing replaced the other China in the Security Council. At the center stage, that was the most important decision.
Entering the WTO is pretty important too.
Yes, absolutely. But we see the results. But in terms of geopolitics and in terms of diplomacy, I think that coming back and taking over was something that was a breakthrough.
Okay.
And I think there is a need that China being recognized as influential, but I don't agree with the term hegemon because it doesn't fit with the culture of China and Asia in general.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on just because we don't have much time left. I've been asked to keep this shorter than originally planned.
I will try to be very short. Alex Martin with GlobSec, and I want to pick up on what Professor Brown said about engaging in the international system but not believing in the underlying values. So how does globalization move forward? Because we knew about the rules of the games and we all played by the same rules. But if we don't believe in the rules any longer, we cannot move. And I do want to make another comment on bipolarity. Doesn't that mean that we have a white and a black and no shades of gray, and that means that the whole world needs to choose one over another?
And just final comment from the gentleman in the 1, 2, 3, 4th row.
Thank you. I'm Doro Costa from Aspen Strategy Group. I was an ambassador to Beijing between 2012 and 2017, so I had a chance of learning firsthand what was going on there. It's unbelievably valuable lesson. 2 points, and which brings to a question. It is also linked to what we have just learned about the question about global rules. 70 years ago, the world order, let's agree, it is an order, was founded. 70 years is quite a long time. It's good to try to adapt to new realities. 20 years ago, we have China in the WTO. It's good to have it adapted, because WTO definitely is not the same as it used to be before 2001. All right. The president, well, actually the Secretary General of the party at the 17th Congress mentioned the role of blazing a path for others to follow. It is not ad verbatim quotation. A Chinese proposal. But it is admittedly built on Chinese characteristics. This is the Chinese message. How does this model, how would this model fit the non-Chinese characteristic world?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Responses? Who would like to begin?
Yeah, so the fundamental issue for the trade war is the accusation from the United States towards China is that it has observed the letter of the law but not the spirit. So it has complied with the letter of the WTO agreements, for instance, but not the spirit. So I'm not making a judgment on that. That is, I think, the basis of the American complaint, and that might be right or wrong. On globalization, the idea was to have enough space for diversity. So China's answer, I guess, would be, as it indigenized Marxism-Leninism and socialism with Chinese characteristics, it is now practicing the Belt and Road, which is Chinese globalization with Chinese characteristics. So I guess the third question, you're talking about a world which is black and white, you know, and kind of very binary. I don't think that's the option. It's very, very subtle. You kind of are allowing, for the first time in modern history, a fundamentally different kind of view of the world to come into our space. I think that's potentially hugely intellectually enriching, but others see it as a threat. But it's not going to go away. So I think we have to become literate in different sorts of systems. That is not moving from black to white. That is basically kind of using different frameworks. So the house has got not only stairs, but also a couple of lifts.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. I'm afraid we need to leave the room. So just final comments, and thank you, Kerry. And would you like to add anything to that very, very quickly?
As I always said, the number one in international order keep a relative this against number two. That's just nature. Okay. But the U.S. is especially good to beat number two. Since 1894, U.S. become the first GDP holder in the world. Immediately, the U.S. dissolved a great empire of the empire of Great Britain, and then Germany, right? And then Japan Empire, right? Then Soviet Empire, right? Then EU, right? So number two, defeated them.
Thank you so much.
But now they face
Shinichi,
China. They have no hope to win, right?
Thank you. Shinichi, final comment from you. Anything you'd like to add to that?
The Belt and Road Initiative has some attractiveness for the, say, emerging market developing countries, say the quick money and the infrastructure. But it comes with the catch of the, say, debt sustainability. So the G20 has adopted the quality infrastructure investment, taking due consideration to debt sustainability. So that kind of the pragmatic way of the finding consensus will pave the way for the peaceful, peace and prosperity.
Marvelous conclusion, a pragmatic way towards peace and prosperity. Let's go for that. Thank you all for being with us. And a warm round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.